for joining today. I'm Sierra Nahale, co-lead for Mosaic Employee, our employee community for BIPOC at Zendesk. Today, we are thrilled to be hosting Zendesk's partner organization, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. AALDF is a New York-based national organization founded in 1974 that protects and promotes the civil rights of Asian Americans by combining litigation, advocacy, education, and organizing. The AALDEF focuses on critical issues including immigrant rights, voting rights, and democracy, economic justice for workers, educational equity, housing, and environmental justice, as well as the elimination of anti-Asian violence, police misconduct, and human trafficking. Here with us to introduce our speaker from the AALDEF is InaMarie Johnson, Chief People and Diversity Officer here at Zendesk. So I will pass it on to you, InaMarie.
All right. Thank you so much, Sierra. Good afternoon, maybe even a good evening, and a very warm Zendesk welcome to you, Phil. You are a former staff attorney and longtime board member of AALDF. And in addition to serving, you have also been the founding executive director of the Asian American Justice Center. You are the curator of the APA program at the Smithsonian Institution, 2010. And then you also teach Asian American history, art, and public policy courses at the University of Maryland, as well as the City College of New York and Yale. And so we really know that for you to find time to spend with us with all of those efforts that you have going on is quite a treat. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you, Phil.
Thank you, InaMarie, and thank you, Sarah and Natalie and everyone else. You know, as I was reading about Zendesk last night, I realized that you've got this word, humbledent, that exactly captures my philosophy. I mean, this whole idea of coming into an interaction, being humble, seeing the other person as worthy of respect, expecting them to respect you, expecting that we all have human rights, civil rights, and being confident as you pursue these interactions. I mean, what a world. I mean, that'll be the end of the program. Let's just all say we'll be humbledent. But I do appreciate the thousands of volunteer hours that you all are doing, the 4,000 employees you have working from Denmark to California, New York, everywhere. I think the feel of the organization that I was able to see, I was a website developer at one point, and I can see that you are really making an effort to bring everybody together and build a team spirit that's very exciting. And I know it's going to help promote good things out in the community as well. So I've been involved with AALDEF for 40 years, if you can believe it. I started as a law student, and AALDEF at the time was just a few years old, but they had some very committed people. And you've already described some of the basic areas of work. But AALDEF was always committed to three things: prevention, intervention, and legislation. And those are three very broad ways of looking at the world. And what we mean by that is prevention is doing programs like this, where we talk to the broader community about Asian Americans, about ways that you can help as an ally, ways that you can get involved helping to mentor somebody in your organization, work out in the community. The prevention means basically building that better world that we all want on a one-to-one basis. And so we do a lot of that through community clinics. There's a lot of things that have to be done that don't just involve big news items. So when something happens, when intervention is required, that's where we resort to what the web developers call burstable bandwidth. All of a sudden, we're going to need you all to help us to do culturally and linguistically appropriate case intake. Remember, the cases that show up on TV are like 1 in 1,000. When I taught law at the City University of New York Law School, I reminded my students, most lawsuits are settled by what they call lumping it. You say, well, forget it. It costs too much. It's not worth it. I don't want to alienate anybody. I don't have the right immigration status. You know, for whatever reason, you decide to not pursue it. So a lot of what AALDEF does when you read about these big cases in Atlanta or Indianapolis or anywhere else, we get calls from people saying, can you talk to my mother? Can you talk to my sister? We talk to someone, we counsel them. We sometimes go with them to a prosecutor. We sometimes find a pro bono attorney, but most of the time it doesn't get in the paper. And that's why when you support a group like AALDEF, you're supporting direct services that help the real people, not just the people who are out in the news. Because like I said, they also deserve justice, but that's not the majority of cases that are being dealt with by us or anyone else. So we have prevention, we have intervention, and finally we have legislation. And what we mean by that, broadly speaking, is trying to find systemic changes, because prevention is about one-to-one changes. I can come and counsel you about your rights in Cantonese, about what happens when someone knocks on your door. Okay, but when that actually happens, we need the intervention. And finally, if that's not enough, we need the legislation. We need to change the laws. We need to change the DACA laws. We need to change these other laws that are affecting people on a broad scale, talking about prosecutor rights, talking about ways of addressing the police force and how much funding goes to that. So many big issues have to be dealt with in a systemic way. And that's why good people like yourselves, who have good skills, who have the willingness, need to work on both levels. We need your help at times to be our burstable bandwidth, to come and help us with language capabilities or other things, to be a polling monitor to make sure that Asian American voters and others get the appropriate help they need to cast their ballots. But then sometimes we need you to go up to Albany, go out to Trenton, go to Sacramento, make your voice heard to get the laws changed. Remember, 100 years ago, if I had said that a woman is going to be a president, you would have laughed, because the Overton window of legislative possibilities at that time was way over here. There were no women voting. Women were basically the property of men. And through the last 100 years, with the voting rights of women, women become able to open their own bank accounts, women able to have their own jobs. We have seen a situation where now a woman is one heartbeat away from the presidency. So we need all you to get out there and moving that Overton window of possibility so that we have human rights and justice for every person. I want to look at Natalie, at Sierra, at InaMarie and say, okay, I have human rights, I have justice, I have self-worth, and that goes to the tip of your nose. And that's where your bodily integrity, that's where your human rights, that's where justice for you applies. And that is something that we are very adamant about. Asian American Legal Defense Fund is not an Asian American organization. We are a human rights and justice organization focusing on Asian Americans. But for many years, we've been part of the Public Interest Law Center, the PILC at 99 Hudson Street, where we have worked with the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, for many years, the LGBT and women's groups and environmental groups and other groups were there as well. So again, it's not just a matter of fighting for my human rights or Asian American human rights. We realize that unless everyone has human rights, unless everyone can vote, unless everyone can have bodily integrity, everyone can have speech, none of us have it. In fact, I've spent a lot of my time in the last couple of years. I was pushing for marriage equality in Maryland. I took some of my students there from the University of Maryland, and one of my students said, you know, I signed up for a course on Asian American history. What are we doing here supporting gay rights? And I said, well, excuse me, first of all, there are gay Asian Americans. And second of all, we're here to support human rights, in this case, for people who are LGBT brothers and sisters. And he got it. And I think everyone who works with us at the Asian American Legal Defense Fund realizes that we are very supportive of others. We have to focus on Asian Americans. We have to focus on the domestic part of it, because there is a global diaspora of people of Asian ancestry that have come over to the United States. But by and large, we've had to focus on the domestic Asian American portion here. Otherwise you get too unfocused and you can't be effective at anything. So that is the background of the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Let me jump back a little bit to the whole notion of Asians and Asian Americans, because this is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. If you asked anybody in any Asian language, there was no word for Asian. Just like the word rocket ship was created in every language, we've had to create the word for Asia. But for example, when my grandparents came here from Japan, they considered themselves Japanese, or even just people from Kagoshima, the southernmost part of Japan. And as we came over here for political reasons, we wanted to have some political clout. We have become Asian Pacific Americans. That has included the Pacific Islanders. And frankly, through many years, almost 30 years of working with Native Americans in Central and South America, as well as North America, I realized that Pacific Islanders have land issues and other issues that are not exactly the same as Asian American. And in fact, some of their issues are closer to our indigenous brothers and sisters who are called Native Americans by some. So this category of Asian evolved because the eastern end of the Euro-Asian landmass was called Asia by somebody. The western half of this Euro-Asian landmass was called Europe. And it goes back even to Latin, the word oriens, the word occident. Oriens means where the sun rises. Occidens means where the sun sets. So an oriental is from the place where the sun's rising. Now realize that there are people in China, for example, they have a character that goes like this, meaning the middle kingdom. So they consider themselves to be the middle, and Japan is the land where the sun rises. But if you're looking at your watch right now, your watch is telling you Greenwich Standard Time. Greenwich is a small observatory up the Thames River from London. So the center of the world for our purposes in the 21st century is Greenwich. And we don't think about it. This is something that we just, it happens. But the Earth doesn't say where's the middle. Somebody had to arbitrarily make that distinction. So we are tied to this notion. And we're also tied to a notion of a centrism of the North American and the upper parts of the globe. When you were going to school, you had a map that was called a Mercator projection map. Gustav Mercator created a very good map for navigating back 400 years ago. He took the top half of the globe and made it 2/3 of his map. And so that's why Greenland looks bigger than India, which has like a 1/7 of the world's population. And that's why Africa, which can actually hold all of the United States, the lower 48 anyway, as well as other things, Africa is huge. Central and South America are huge. But because of this perception, this centrism that we have created, that the middle of the world is the Atlantic Ocean between Europe and North America, that's an artificial construct. One map I used to have on my wall was called the Australian view of the world. It was upside down from what we usually have, and it had Australia right in the middle, had Indonesia, had all these other things. I said, darn it, we're the middle of the world. And so again, we have to always think to ourselves. And that's why this notion of humbledent is so important. We have to approach every interaction being humble and not feeling like we're entitled to be the center of the conversation or the center of the world. We have to realize that other people have other ways of looking at things. And what we call white privilege, what we call male privilege, certain ways that some people have been advantaged for reasons that are not due to merit, but are due to historical and political and sociological issues. Those are things that have happened, and we need to change them. So coming back to Asian Americans, if you look back to the census in 1790, the first US Census asked 6 questions. It said, who is the head of the household? So again, that was usually a male. And then they said, who are the white men over 16, the white men under 16, who are the white women, who are the enslaved people, and who are the free people who are not white. And when you think about that way of organizing the world, white men became adults in the eyes of the law. At age 16, you could own land, you could sit in a jury, you could fight in the military. There were a lot of things, rights and privileges that you got. White women never became adults in the eyes of the law. They still were the property of men. Enslaved people, Asian Americans were not mentioned, Latinx people were not mentioned. So if you think of it, that way of looking at the world persists. And again, that notion of who is entitled, who is part of the conversation, that mindset is still there. And we Asian Americans continue to be seen as perpetual foreigners. So let's look again at that notion of Oriental. When you have East versus West, it means that there's going to be this constant struggle. And we Asian Americans never get a chance to be the middle. We never get a chance to be insiders. We're always seen as outsiders. And the bad thing, it's even worse, is East versus West means there's no North and South. Those of us who are of African background, Central and South American background, you don't even count. You're not part of that East versus West. So we Asian Americans are part of that perpetual foreigner situation. But Asian Americans have been here for hundreds of years. We've been here since the 1600s when some Filipino Americans jumped off the Spanish galleons and came in. We have been here down in Louisiana, in California, and other places. Starting in the mid 1800s, we came over to dig for gold. We ended up being segregated into laundry and restaurant work, not because we're cleaner or we like cooking. It's because we were forbidden to do certain things, and certain quote unquote women's work was stuff that wasn't going to pay as much. And so rather than let us dig for gold, we're told, hey, you go pick the crops and you go do the laundry and the cooking. So Asian Americans have faced that type of discrimination. But since then, we have had many waves of Asian Americans come in. And Asian Americans were not only Chinese Americans, but Japanese Americans, Filipino Americans, South Asians, and others. But rather than give you a fire hose of information, I'd like to ask you to think about Asian American history, and frankly, any history, in three buckets. The first bucket is we've had some success. Okay, almost any Asian American Heritage Month program you've been to talks about the Olympic athletes, the figure skaters who won the Olympics. You know, yes, there's been many successes. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Same with Women's History Month, same with LGBT Month. Great. Let's talk about success stories. But the second way we have to look at Asian Americans is what is the discrimination we face? What are the barriers we face? And to that extent, Asian Americans, like many other groups, have faced local, state, regional, and national laws. And those laws came from legislatures, they came from courts, they came from executive orders, and they also came from interpersonal situations. So there are people who hit us over the head. We have been lynched, we have been burned. Basically all the cities, the big cities on the West Coast have had large Asian American communities burned. If you go to Watsonville, California, back in 1931, the Filipino American community was chased out of town and one man was killed. If you are South Asian, you can go up to Washington State and in Everett and Bellingham, Washington, back in 1903 and 1907. The Sikh community, which was called Hindu, Hindoo, because again, when you're looking at stereotypes and you don't really want to get to know people very much, you call them whatever you want. So these Hindu people were loggers, and they were chased out of town too. Some of them went to British Columbia, some of them went down to the Imperial Valley. So we have had success, we've had discrimination. And then the third way of looking at Asian American history is we fought back, and in the process of fighting back, we have vindicated rights for all people. And it's very important to think about that, whether you're looking at women's history, LGBT history, Latinx history, African American history. If you don't have that sense of agency, if you don't have that sense that we took it upon ourselves to assert our rights and to be full human beings, and in the process of doing that, vindicate rights for everyone, well, then we just become a group. You can say Asian Americans are the victims of anti-Asian violence. Okay, so factually that is true. Some of us are getting hit and killed and shot, all true. But if you want to see us as more than that, just the same way we've stopped saying slaves and we start saying enslaved people. There were people who were temporarily enslaved, have since their descendants are no longer enslaved, and now we can talk about the full range of accomplishments, discrimination, and ways they fought back and have accomplished so much and vindicated rights. So Asian Americans are all three of those things, the accomplishments, the discrimination, and what we fought back. And if you take time to look at each of these groups, for example, Chinese Americans came over, many of them had push and pull factors, meaning that some of them were pulled over here by the promise of gold and of better jobs, and some of them were pushed because of famine, because of other factors. So again, whenever people talk about something being all discrimination or all good times, it's probably a little bit of both. And that's why when these Chinese Americans came over, as just one example, some of them came to San Francisco, and in the 1870s, 1880s, they were working as laundry owners. And remember, at the time, laundry wasn't the coin-operated laundry. This was building a big fire and going like this on top of a big vat of clothes. And so San Francisco, as you know, is a peninsula. So they have many days with wind going across. And so they wanted to have an ordinance that said you must have a stone building if you're going to have a laundry. Okay, that makes a lot of sense from a public health and safety point of view. The problem was that this ordinance only applied to the Asian, the Chinese guys who were trying to have a laundry. If you were white and you wanted to have a laundry, you applied and you were given a license, even if you had a wooden structure. So these Chinese owners of laundries took it all the way up to the Supreme Court. They hired white lawyers, and they ultimately had a case decision called Yik Wo versus Hopkins. And Yik Wo versus Hopkins said that if one person is Chinese American and one person is some other group, and they're both applying and one gets a license and one does not, that violates equal protection. And now, if you are bringing a case and you go to any court and you're saying, I have been denied my rights as a woman, as a gay person, as an older person, as an immigrant from Nigeria, I have to have my rights vindicated through equal protection. And I'm going to cite that case, Yik Wo versus Hopkins. So again, most people who cite Yik Wo versus Hopkins have no idea who these Chinese laundry owners from the 1880s were, but that case vindicated an important right for every person. So to move ahead then, Asian Americans have been here since the 1850s. We've also had the Japanese Americans coming in. They also came to the West Coast. They also came to Hawaii. Many of them worked in fishing, agriculture, other things. Some of them were used as scabs, as labor against some of the other workers. You know, it's not a history where they are the heroes and nobody else is. When you understand history, it's always more complicated. But the Japanese Americans faced some very severe situations in 1942 when my mom and her family were put behind barbed wire in the Japanese American internment camps. And this was a wholesale violation of the rights of these people. Instead of giving them individual hearings to see who would be loyal to the US, who would be loyal to Japan, they were guilty by the reason of race. And we all realize in retrospect that that was wrong. And luckily, Japanese Americans and others raised their voices after 9/11 and said, you can't do this to our Muslim, Arab, South Asian brothers and sisters. You can't just take all of them and put them behind barbed wire because they look like these people who may be our enemy. So Japanese Americans suffered, but again, by fighting for redress and then fighting for the rights of these other people, we have helped to prevent a recurrence. When you look at people from South Asia, they came in starting in the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century. And like I said, some of them were lumberjacks, some of them worked in agriculture. The first Asian American congressman was elected in 1956. His name was Dalip Singh Sond. He was a gentleman who went to the University of California at Berkeley and got a degree in 1922 in mathematics. Well, as you know, today, if you get a degree from Cal in mathematics, you can go to Silicon Valley, you can pretty much name your ticket, being a teacher or anything else. When Dalip Singh Song graduated, he went out to become a salesman of agricultural fertilizer. And that was the opportunity he had. He became very good at it. He ended up becoming a local magistrate judge. Finally, he decided to run for office. He very cleverly said, elect Judge D.S. Sond for Congress. So again, many people didn't know at the time that he was Asian Indian or Sikh. And he was elected. So he served 3 terms through the late 50s, early 60s. He was there when John F. Kennedy was president. He was our first congressman of Asian Pacific American ancestry. Asian Indians have continued to come in and make a big impact on our community. I remember back in the 1980s when I was first teaching Asian American history, I was up at Yale and I saw there was an Asian Indian woman in my class. I nothing in my syllabus related to Asian Indians because I didn't know anything about the Asian Indian community. Luckily, I had the foresight to ask her, could you please talk to your mom, see if there's someone who could talk to us. She found somebody who was a PhD from Rutgers University. She took the train up to New Haven, and I sat in the back and dutifully took notes while she talked about the history of Asian Indians in the US. And I've subsequently learned a lot, but that is the way all of us have had to bring different excluded groups into into the bigger tent. So Asian Americans started to include South Asians, Southeast Asians, Filipino Americans. Filipinos were not considered aliens the way the rest of us were. They were considered nationals. And the reason for that is the Philippines came to the US by being a colony and then a territory. You've probably heard of the Spanish-American War at the turn of the 20th century. The US was fighting against Spain. And after winning that battle, they had claims to land in Puerto Rico, in Cuba, Hawaii. And there's very interesting cases called the insular cases that you might want to read about, where Hawaii, which had been a sovereign nation with a king, longstanding tradition, all of a sudden this area was annexed. And again, there's always ways of creating these words, of stealing somebody else's stuff. Just the same way on Columbus Day, I always walk in and I look around and I take somebody's knapsack and they go, "Professor, you're taking my knapsack." I go, "No, I'm not. I discovered your knapsack." So, there's always ways we can point out when there's a little bit of hypocrisy. But so Hawaiian Americans, and when you say Hawaiian, we have to always remember that means the native Hawaiian people. That means people like Sierra and others who have roots that go back thousands of years in that area. And we also have people from Guam, people from other areas in the Pacific Islands who have deep roots that go way back. And then there are people of other backgrounds who live there, who can say, I live in Guam or I live in the Marshall Islands. But there are people with the language and culture who actually are from that area. So those are Pacific Islanders, the Filipino Americans. When you have Korean Americans, you have to remember that Korea was a colony of Japan for 40 years, from 1910 to 1945. And when people say Asian Americans are all the same, you have to remember that when I was working at AALDEF back in the 80s, and I saw somebody from Korea and they didn't speak English very well, I don't speak Korean, I figured, well, gee, I speak some Japanese. Why don't I speak to them in some Japanese? They wouldn't speak to me in Japanese because that was the language of the oppressor. And they would be darned if they were going to speak Japanese. They want to speak in their language. And we finally got a Korean interpreter. Same way with people from Southeast Asia. I speak some French. I tried to speak to some people who were from Vietnam, who France used to be a colonizer there. But people said, no, I don't want to speak French. I want to have someone translate for me from Vietnamese or my other Southeast Asian language. And that's appropriate. And that's why we have to remember that there is no monolithic Asian American community. The other thing we have to realize as we talk about Asian Americans is that we're about 4% of the US population, and we're well over 50% of the global population. Now, how did that happen? We were excluded. There was all kinds of filterings that prevented us from coming in and reaching the equilibrium that would have been more than 50% of the US population. So starting back in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. Before that, there was the Page Act. There were a number of different acts that restricted the flow of Asians to the United States. There were laws that kept the Japanese Americans out. So all of these laws were meant to keep us out of this country. And it was only in 1965 that we started to see people coming in large numbers. And again, the 1965 law change was not because they suddenly started loving Asian Americans. This was actually meant to try to help Irish Americans and having a larger number of cousins of Irish Americans come in. This is something Edward Kennedy and others were pushing. But what happened that was very interesting was as we were letting people come in, a large number of very smart Asian Americans were coming in because in the late 1950s, the Russian Sputnik satellite had gone up and was going around the Earth. And the United States realized that we were behind in the space race. And they realized we better get some mathematicians, some physicists, some other people over here as engineers can help us out. So half the world's population is Asia. So they started bringing over some very smart people to go to our best universities and then go to work at Lawrence Livermore, Bell Labs, AT&T, whatever. And so we started to get this perception that Asian Americans were incredibly smart. But if you know Asian Americans, you will realize that we are like anyone else. There is a bell curve. And there are some very smart Asian Americans and some not so smart Asian Americans, some very good musicians and some not so good musicians, some people who are great athletes and not so great athletes. And because this skewed sample came in, imagine if we had gone to Ghana, a country in Africa, and we had taken the top 0.1% of the math scholars there to come over and study at our top university. You'd be sitting in your math class going, oh my God, no way I'm getting an A. There's 3 guys from Ghana sitting here. So again, this selective immigration allowed the perception to grow that Asian Americans were all smart. And articles started being written in the mid 60s saying Asian Americans are a model minority. And by model, it meant that they were smart, they were obedient, they didn't raise their voices. And guess what was happening in the 60s at that time? There are a lot of people, including some Asian Americans, incidentally, but a lot of African Americans, a lot of Latinx people, others who are saying, darn it, we want our rights. We want liberation. We want to be treated as full human beings. And so this wedge was being driven between groups where we can say, you brown and black children, it's your own fault. You know, the system works. Look at these kids going from the greengrocer, going from the Chinese laundry, showing up at our best universities. Clearly, the system works. So this model minority myth hurt the other people of color. It hurt Asian Americans because those of us who had mental disabilities, had learning problems, those of us who had socioeconomic issues, some of us were refugees coming over and didn't have these advantages because we were put in these same communities with the Black and brown brothers and sisters where there weren't social services, there wasn't education, there weren't jobs. We had the same problems, but yet all of a sudden the teachers would say, hey, look, you look Asian. How come you're not good in math? So the model minority myth created problems for everyone, and it needs to be gotten rid of. I know a lot of Asian Americans like the model minority myth. They like to believe they are smarter than everyone else. I can tell you, it's not helping you, and it will not help you, and it's going to continue to lead to the problems we're seeing. The George Floyd problem, all these other problems are part of this notion where we are not full human beings. We are people who are stereotypes. We're people who are less than white. If you can be white, you're the best. You can be a minority, even if you're a model minority, and then you can aspire to be the number 2 while you continue to oppress the other people. So we've got these 2 paradigms, the perpetual foreigner, we've got the model minority, and you bring those together and we have something called conditional citizenship. And that's the crux of what we're seeing right now in Atlanta, what we're seeing in Indianapolis, where our Sikh brothers and sisters were killed, where you can be the smartest person, you can have the best grades, the best degrees, you're a concert pianist, good for you. You walk out the door, someone hates you because they hate the people from China. And even if you're not from China, you get hit on the head and it's lights out. That's it. And so we have to remember that this conditional citizenship, where you can be liked as long as you're the accountant sitting in the back room and you don't make waves, as long as you don't run for office, as long as you don't say, hey, I want to be the boss 5 years from now. If you want to be second class, fine, be a model minority, but even then you are oppressing other people. So we have to get rid of these 3 stereotypes, the perpetual foreigner, this notion of the model minority, and this notion of conditional citizenship. And to do that, we have to move towards something, again, like this Humbledent idea that I'm glad you have it. I wish I had trademarked it first. but this notion where you come into every interaction being humble. And again, that means that you have a humility, but you are confident. It has to be both of those things. I come into an interaction with Natalie where I am the male, she is the female, she is white, I am Asian. Which one is going to trump, given all the stereotypes we have here? It shouldn't be. We shouldn't have to think that way. I should see myself as a human being, expecting her to treat me with respect, expecting that she will give me human rights. I expect that I will give her the same. So again, that's where this Humbledon idea is so important. What I recommend to all my students is that they move toward having a toolkit where they all aspire to have a toolkit of cultural competence. And the reason for that is that we are all swimming in an ocean of isms, and every one of us is wet. Let me say that again. We are swimming in an ocean of isms, and I am racist, I am sexist, I am homophobic, I am ageist, and on and on and on. I grew up swimming in that ocean, and I have tried through my humility, through interacting with people with respect, hoping that when I say something to Sierra, that she will say to me, well, Phil, that was a little bit sexist. Maybe you could say it this way. And I'll say, thank you very much, and I will try to get better. So at this point, I'm not living by walking on eggshells, hoping nobody will call me out for being sexist and racist. I have confidently made these mistakes, not blatantly pushing it in people's faces, making sexist jokes or carrying swastikas, but by inadvertently making the same mistakes because I am wet from the sea of isms. And over the course of years, going to the various mosques and synagogues and churches, by learning about people's sacred literature, by learning about their customs, by trying to find out more about my fellow brothers and sisters, I, at this point, am pretty confident that I'm not going to make too many mistakes, but I still hope that I don't make too many. And so by having this cultural confidence and this cultural competence toolkit, I'm able to navigate a meeting where I see somebody who's averting their eyes from me. And part of me says, well, they must not be very trustworthy. They're averting their eyes from me. Or I can be a little bit culturally competent and say, well, maybe she's from Hawaii, maybe she's from Latin America, and she's learned to avert her eyes from me because I'm an elder. Or maybe she could say, Professor, I dropped my contact lens. Can you help me find it? So it could be the third variable here. Could be the first, the second, or the third situation. And so having a little bit of cultural competence is not good enough. We have to keep growing, changing, asking questions. If something doesn't make sense to you, ask about it. Always approach every interaction with that humility. And so, again, what I would hope that each of you do, and you're well on your way here at Zendesk, is to think about ways that you could move this Overton window of possibilities within your own life on an interpersonal level and also on a societal level. I want to get to a world where somebody can aspire to be president or the president of Zendesk. And we don't have to say, oh my God, he's gay, there's no way he can be president, or oh my God, he's Black, there's no way he can be. No, I want it to be, gee, this person has good management skills, this person is good at X, Y, and Z. This person could possibly be president of the United States or Zendesk or University of Maryland or anything else. So that is my quick overview of Asian American history and AALDEF. And why don't we just open it to questions, see if people have any other questions. Thank you.